Good evening. My name is Alex, and I am from Programming and Learning Services at Vancouver Public Library. We are delighted to partner with UBC Life Sciences Institute for this evening's discussion on tuberculosis, a silent local killer and global threat. Tuberculosis, or TB, has plagued humankind since antiquity. Today, it infects 1/3 of the local population, or the world population, and new drugs are urgently needed to prevent the spread of resistant strains. Our internationally acclaimed speakers present the local and global state of TB, as well as the cutting edge of approaches to combating the disease. We would like to recognize that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people and to thank the members of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations for their hospitality. I would like to remind you to turn off all cell phones, as well as highlighting a few upcoming programs at Central Library that might interest you. On Monday evening, March 30th at 7 p.m. in the Ellis Mackay Room, VPL presents Evening of Music, Swing is in the Air, performed by Vancouver Community College Jazz.
Yes, I do.
The band is directed by Alan Matheson and will be featuring the music of composer and arranger Billy Strayhorn. And on Tuesday, April 2nd, Vancouver Opera and VPL present Opera Talks. Walter White, Hannibal Lecter, Dexter Morgan, Sweeney Todd, they fascinate and frighten. A panel of experts explores the popularity of sociopaths and psychopaths in literature, film, television, and popular culture. If you're interested in these programs or many others offered at the library, you will find more information at our events brochure on the table, or the events calendar on our website, vpl.ca. We appreciate your feedback. Completed evaluation forms can be placed on the literature table at the back, and I've put some on the table. Thank you very much. And now we are delighted to have Peter Cullis, Director of the Life Sciences Department, here this evening. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Okay, so thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks for the introduction. Just wanted to say this is we're speaking on behalf of the Life Sciences Institute. I'd just like to welcome you all to our public talks. This public talk is on, of course, tuberculosis. I've got a list of things I have to thank people for here, so if it sounds like, anyway, my speaking notes are I've been told if I don't do this properly, I've got problems. Anyway, so I just want to thank Himani Bhatnagar for creating the attention-grabbing slide that we see here in front of us. And just a note or two about our sponsors and our partners. The Vancouver Public Library has certainly been a great partner to us over the last year and a half. And this is getting to be an event that we're all very much connected with and looking forward to. It's a good way for us to get the word out to the public about what we're doing at the university. So our sponsors tonight are the Center for Tuberculosis Research and the TBVets. How did this happen? I seem to be flashing ahead here. TBVets Charitable Foundation. They've supported this particular event with some generosity, and we want to acknowledge and applaud that for the TBVets Foundation. It's over 70 years. TBVets have supported TB research, treatment, and prevention, and they're now a community leader in the fight against all respiratory illnesses. And so we would like to, we certainly want to bring that attention. TBVets is represented here tonight by Cheryl Fraser. And you can find the TBVets online at the URL is indicated here, and also, of course, on Twitter. Just a note or two about the Life Sciences Institute. It's the largest institute on campus. UBC is #1 in Canada. It ranks by international standings in terms of life science research, and the Life Sciences Institute is the largest institute. Life Sciences Institute, actually the largest institute on campus. And so we have we have excellence in basic science research. We're also realizing opportunities in personalized medicine, and I'll say a word or two about that. And also, we're very much concerned with new economic opportunities that arise from the research that's being conducted at LSI and UBC, and so pushing that forward. So this is just indicating some of the numbers, 35 million in annual research funding. We have translational products where we're actually taking basic molecular level findings and bringing them into the clinic. And so also in the area of knowledge translation in other ways. Now, just a word on what personalized medicine is. Presently, you're all aware, you go to a doctor, he looks at you, does a few basic but examinations that are more at the macromolecular level. Personalized medicine is really taking stock of you as an individual, your genetic code, proteins in your blood, microbes in your microbiome, and on the basis of this molecular level characterization, we're going to be able to much more accurately detect disease, match therapy to whatever disease, and also enable effective preventive care. So this is the medicine of the future, and the Life Sciences Institute is deeply committed to making that happen. So just a word on the LSI Public Talks. This has been going on, as I mentioned, for about a year and a half, or over a year now. And with topics ranging from autism to diabetes and obesity, personalized medicine itself, getting into the mechanics and the basics of personalized medicine, and then tonight, of course, focusing really on tuberculosis. So the speakers tonight are Bill Jacobs and Kevin Elwood, and they're going to be introduced by our moderator, Jeremy Hirota. So, Jeremy.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming on this wonderful Vancouver dry evening and coming out to the public library for this exciting evening. I'm Jeremy Hirota. I'm a professor in the Division of Respiratory Medicine, and I deal with occupational and environmental lung diseases, specifically asthma, a little bit of COPD, and zero tuberculosis research. So I, like a lot in the audience, am also here to learn, and we have some excellent speakers today that we can learn much from. So really, why am I here? I don't know if there's anybody who knows this person here. This is Dr. Jennifer Gardy, a UBC professor, but also an occasional speaker on and guest host of the CPC Nature of Things. And she actually asked me, because I have interest in public outreach and communicating science to the public, she said, Jeremy, why don't you come down and moderate the talks? And I won't say that she threatened me, but I didn't want to get on the other side of her, what is that, left hook there. But not knowing anything about tuberculosis and not knowing anything about the distinguished speakers tonight, the first thing I did was did a little research. And researchers and scientists, the first thing they'll do is they'll go to PubMed. They won't go to Twitter, they won't go to Wikipedia, they won't go to Facebook, they'll go to PubMed. And so that's what I did. I went to PubMed, and I typed in Dr. Jacobs' name here, and I put in Dr. Jacobs' initials and tuberculosis. And I'll just say a conservative estimate of 238 papers came up. Now, that might not mean much to you that do not publish papers, but an average PhD might publish 3 papers. So Bill's got 70 PhDs in tuberculosis research. So I think we're in good hands tonight. And as well with Dr. Elwood, there's also several, I think over 20 PhDs worth of work here when we look at his expertise in TB. And I reiterate, 0 publications in TB. I've got publications in other things, but not TB. So again, I'm part of the audience here. I'm here to learn, and hopefully we can learn a lot from the speakers today. And really, this is the look on my face when I realized all those papers that these speakers had. And I thought to myself, what have I got into? Thanks, Jen Gardy. But I thought, well, is there something that I can bring to this table and to this evening and to the discussion? And I think I can. As I said, I've got interest in science communications and public outreach, and just last year I was at the Banff Center for a 2-week science communications workshop put on by Jay Ingram, formerly of the Discovery Channel, and his partner, Marianne Moser. I'm also advertising it because you'll see there's a deadline March 31st for the 2015 workshop. So for those of you that are interested in science communications, they are still accepting applications. So really, using that science communications training, I kind of thought of some rules that I will throw down to the speakers. First, acknowledge that the audience may not be experts in this area of tuberculosis, including myself. And in doing that, do your best, I have to ask you, to limit the technical jargon so that people can take away something from this evening that they can tell their families and spread awareness about TB. And maybe a suggestion could be, and I'm sure you guys have your own styles, but to craft a story whereby we can connect TB and the problems associated with TB, and the audience can take this home. So since I'm not an expert, what I did do, I'm an expert in research though, and I found a good source for some information on TB. The Economist just published a piece earlier, last year in 2014, and it sort of was a high-level overview of the economic impact and the health impact of tuberculosis around the world. So what I've got here is just a minute-and-a-half video taken from this article with some infographics and some facts to sort of set the stage for the evening on what's currently going on with TB in the world. So hopefully this will play.
Did you know that tuberculosis is the world's deadliest infectious disease after AIDS, and that its global burden amounts to roughly $12 billion annually?
Just listen.
Spread by a simple cough or sneeze, tuberculosis does not discriminate. Yet it disproportionately affects the poor and those living in developing countries, where it thrives on inadequate public health provision. Drug resistance is also a growing problem, accounting for 5% of new cases and 13% of deaths globally. Fewer than a quarter of people with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis are properly diagnosed and treated, increasing the risk of further spread. A lack of data, extensive stigma, and inadequate global funding are barriers to better control of tuberculosis. Although improved efforts have saved 22 million lives since 1995, this curable disease still kills over 1 million people each year. Combating tuberculosis globally requires finding and treating people where they live, involving the health system as a whole and harnessing cost-effective technology. Download the full report developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and supported by Janssen.
My apologies, but there were some very, very nice animations that were supposed to accompany that. But this is available, freely available online, as I have the resource here, The Economist. So if you would like to see those infographics that are associated with those facts, please feel free to search this on your own. So at this point, without any further ado, I'd like to present the speakers. First, Dr. Bill Jacobs is coming from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He's a professor of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology and in the Department of Genetics. He's an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and he's the Leo and Julia Forchheimer Chair in Microbiology and Immunology. His research interests are clearly in tuberculosis, looking at drug development, vaccine development, and the genetics of tuberculosis. Our second speaker for the evening is Dr. Kevin Elwood. He's a clinical professor emeritus here at UBC. His research interests are also in TB, including the molecular and the clinical epidemiology of tuberculosis, which is following tuberculosis in the population and monitoring it at a population level. And his teaching interests are also in the undergraduate program here at UBC. So without further ado, Dr. Bill Jacobs. Thank you.
I got the mic on.
You got the mic on?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Stephanie's going to help with the talk.
Terrific.
And I will say, for questions, there's pieces of paper on your table, and if there are questions come up during the talks, if you can, just write down the questions, and we'll collect them afterwards in the intermission, and then I'll moderate with those questions. If there are burning questions, really burning questions you have to ask during the talk, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll do our best to address those questions. Thank you.
Let me thank you for the invitation to come here. It's a great honor to tell you about one of my passions, and that is this problem of tuberculosis. I want to tell you today, the take-home message you got to come away with today is what makes TB so effective is it's like Harry Houdini. And I want you to think about that as we go through. Now, I grew up in western Pennsylvania. I grew up in a steelworkers ghetto. You know, everybody worked in the steel mills. And I went to a small state school in Pennsylvania. I went to this place called Edinburgh State College. It was started in 1847. And while I was there, I was a mathematics major. I mean, I always liked biology, but I can't memorize unrelated facts. I have to derive everything. And while I was there, I took a microbial genetics course, and it changed my life. I wanted to be a microbial geneticist. And when I applied from Edinburgh State College as a math major to get in a microbiology department, most schools didn't even return my letter. And in fact, when you look at Edinburgh, I mean, it's not known for many people. This gentleman actually is the most decorated wrestler in the United States history. He won 4 Olympic medals. This woman was a classmate when I was there. She doesn't keep in touch. And then, you know, I was elected to the National Academy of Sciences last year, but I don't think they know at Edinburgh what the National Academy of Sciences really is. I went there. When I applied to graduate school, I ended up getting an interview at University of Alabama, Birmingham. And I went down there and met a man named Roy Curtis III, who eventually became my mentor. And the first day I met him, the first hour I met him, I told him, Roy, you know, I don't know much biology. And he told me, you know, there is no sin in being ignorant. The sin is to remain ignorant. Now, we all believe that, right? Well, in fact, the way I give my lectures now, and it doesn't matter where I do it, at Harvard or Princeton or Cambridge or Oxford, is I pass out questions numbers beforehand, and somebody has number 1. What I want you to do is help me, stand up, read me the question, and tell me the answer. And it won't hurt, you know, so you're with Bill for the next 25 minutes. He likes you just the way you are. So who's got one? Help me.
In 2005, 42 HIV-infected patients in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, were diagnosed with tuberculosis and TB, and their average time to death was 16 days. Explain why.
They walked into this hospital. They were diagnosed with TB. They were started on 4 drugs. And here's the survival curve. Half of them were dead in 16 days. They were given the drugs. What can you say about the drugs? They weren't working. But there was a good reason. They actually had evolved. These strains of tuberculosis have evolved resistance to all 10 drugs that we use to treat TB. This is called extensively drug-resistant TB. We have seen it in Africa. We have seen it in China. We have seen it in South America and in India. And this is a result of evolution. That even though we have the antibiotics, they're becoming ineffective. This is the hospital I first went to in 2005 in KwaZulu-Natal. By the way, Kwa means home of the Zulu. KwaZulu, and Natal was the city of Durban. This hospital in 2005, all these patients had XDR-TB. It's the first place I've been. I've really been afraid, because if I get XDR-TB, there are no drugs. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute has gone and built a new research center in the city of Durban to combat this collision of tuberculosis with the growing epidemic of HIV. If you look at this province of KwaZulu-Natal, what's unique to this area of the world is not only it's the home of the Zulu, but the incidence of HIV is 10 to 30%. 1 to 3 people you see on the street are likely infected with HIV. And that immunosuppression with tuberculosis that's already there is causing a syndemic that worsens both diseases. Those red dots that you see were where the first index cases of extensively drug-resistant TB was found. Look what happened in just 2 years' time. It's a matter of time before this is going to spread around the world. Who's got 2, please? Now, this is a question I wish I could ask every member of the U.S. Congress, but go ahead.
How many people live on planet Earth?
Do you know? We just passed 7 billion last year. I guarantee you less than 30% of our U.S. Congress would know, and less than them would know, significantly less, would know that 1 in 3 people on planet Earth are subclinically infected with TB. TB typically will infect and it'll just be dormant. But if you become immunosuppressed, there's always the threat that it's going to come back. Who's got number 3, please?
Imagine you started medical school in 1847. What were you taught were the 3 probable causes of consumption of TB?
Here's the textbook used. Samuel Fitch's Use of the Lung. Do you have any idea what they might have been taught back then? First one was mechanical, sort of like a genetic. Everybody in the family would have it. The second hypothetical cause in this was effeminacy. More women had it, and the guys who wrote operas and painted paintings, more of them had it. And the third was it was a poison. Now, as basic scientists, we want to understand what the truth is, what's involved. And it matters, right? Because depending upon which is right, your therapies would be different. Right? If the cause is effeminacy, you know the cure is hunting and fishing with Dick Cheney. You know, who's got 4? Please.
Jean-Antoine Villemin, a medic in the French army, wrote a revolutionary paper on consumption in 1865. While surgically removing bullets from soldiers' lungs, he observed the presence of granulomas exclusively in consumptive lungs. What radical hypothesis did he make, and how did he try to test it?
You have any idea? So imagine, he's cutting out the bullets. You know, people have been shot. And he observes that the guys who have consumption is characterized, that's what TB used to be called, because you would cough, you would have night sweats, fever, chills, and you'd waste away. That's why it was called consumption. He observed that those that had consumption had these little white masses. They're called granulomas living in them. But he knew that was very different than lung cancer. You know, if he looked at a lung cancer, it was one solid mass. And he hypothesized that tuberculosis was infectious. And to test that, what he did was he cut out the mass from somebody with a sarcoma, a lung cancer, and he put it in the rabbits. Nothing happened to the rabbits. But when he cut out the little white masses, the granulomas from TB, all of them got consumption. It was the first time anybody had shown that tuberculosis was an infectious disease. Who's got 5? Please.
What was the first bacterium found to be associated with a human disease? Who made this discovery? How did this discoverer try to prove the bacterium caused the disease?
Any idea on this one?
It was smallpox. No, not smallpox.
Well, Robert Koch, it wasn't him. You know, so it was related to tuberculosis. There's what?
Leprosy.
Leprosy. Very good. In the mid-1850s, for reasons we still don't understand, in the Scandinavian countries, leprosy was prevalent throughout the Scandinavian countries. And he had one of Leeuwenhoek's microscopes, and he took a biopsy from a leper and put it under a microscope, and he stained it, and he saw bacteria. And that was the first time that anybody ever saw a bacterium associated with human disease. It's important to know that the leprosy bacillus, which I did my PhD on, is related to the tubercle bacillus that causes tuberculosis. Even though they're very different, they're family members in the same family. Very good. Who's got 6? Please.
What was the treatment of choice for TB in the United States from 1875 to 1954?
Have any idea about this one?
Fresh air?
It was, and not only fresh air. So it was started by this man's great-great-grandfather, Gary Trudeau, a good Canadian name there. Gary Trudeau does the Doonesbury comic strip. This particular one's about a guy who comes in and has tuberculosis. He diagnosed him and he asked him, do you believe in evolution? And the man says, no. And he said, well, I can't give you the new drugs, but unfortunately you have evolved a multi-drug resistant strain. His great-great-grandfather, one of my heroes, is this man, Edward Livingston Trudeau. He graduated from Columbia Medical School back in 1868 when tuition was $300 for the 3 years of medical school. And he took care of his brother who had consumption. And 3 years later, right down on 14th Street in New York City, he was diagnosed by Charlie Janeway's great-great-grandfather. And he was told he had consumption. And he walked out, and that's what he wrote in his autobiography. That he said that, you know, I feel like a man that's at the bar and told he going to die. And he figured if he's going to die anyway, he had read Dr. Fitch's book. He liked to hunt and fish. So he went up to the mountains, up by Saranac Lake, by Lake Placid area. And in the fresh air and sunlight, he got better. So he set up the first sanatorium, this little cottage that you can see on the Saranac, on the Trudeau campus to this day, where the treatment was bed rest, fresh air, and sunlight. It's interesting that Barry Bloom and Robert Monlin have published papers that if you take vitamin D, that comes from macrophages, if you add that to macrophages, that comes from the sunlight, the vitamin D, and you add it to macrophages with TB infected, it slows down the growth of the TB. So there was something to it. And that grew into sanatorium all across the world. The last sanatorium that was built on the planet was built in the Bronx. And we get to look at it every day from our Biosafety Level 3 lab. This is the Van Etten Hospital that we see from my Biosafety Level lab, Biosafety Level 3 lab in the Bronx. Who's got 7?
Christmas, 1882, Edwin Livingston Trudeau got a translation of a German science paper and said it was the best Christmas present ever. What did he receive?
You have any idea? There's a man named Robert Koch, and he had written a paper. Read this while I'm talking about this. The reason why I love this guy Trudeau was he got a handwritten copy. He said, surely I never had a Christmas present meant more to me than that big handwritten copy of his book. I read every word of it over and over again. And there was a paper by Robert Koch that was written in 1882 on what the cause of consumption was. And the reason why I love Trudeau was he was so excited when he read this paper. He set up the first research lab in the country to reproduce Robert Koch's work. Who's got 8?
I do. What did Robert Koch have to do to prove that TB was caused by the invasion and multiplication of the tubercle bacilli?
Yeah, tubercle bacillus, very good. Do you know what he had to do? Robert Koch was trained by the guy Henle, like Henle loops in the kidney, and they had come out with a postulate. And they said, you know, you would have to see the organism. Robert Koch knew Willem's work, and you knew Hansen's work. Hansen knew it too. And the second answer to your question before about what he tried to do, Hansen knew that you had to get the bacteria and you had to transfer it. He knew Willem's work as well. You know what Hansen did? If you read his autobiography, he injected himself 3 times with leprosy material, and he was disappointed he never got leprosy. And then when he injected 2 of his patients, they sort of kicked him out of the village. What Robert Koch wrote in his 1882 paper, and this is directly from that 1882 paper, he said to prove that tuberculosis is caused by evasion and multiplication of bacteria. You have to isolate the bacteria, you got to grow it in pure culture, you got to transfer it. He knew Willem's transfer experiment. He knew Hansen's paper. So he took the granulomas from TB, he stained them, he saw it. But he went one step further. He made a culture media. What he did was he took serum from a cow, and he would heat it, cool it, heat it, cool it, heat it, cool it. It would be like a fried egg. And he put that in a tube, and he added the material from somebody with TB, and he grew the bacteria. And then he took that bacteria and he transferred it to rabbits, guinea pigs, dogs, cats. They all got consumption. And he knew, because he fulfilled these 3 conditions. This is called Koch's postulate. If you fulfill these 3 conditions, you know that the organism is caused by the bacteria. It was the first time that we knew. That's why Trudeau was so excited. He knew it wasn't, bad air. He knew it wasn't a mechanical cause. He knew it wasn't effeminacy. He knew it was now a bacterium. Who's got 9? You want to try? You know, when I started working on TB in 1985, we didn't know of a target of a drug named isoniazid that closed a sanatorium. You know, that last sanatorium I showed you closed its doors in 1954 for TB patients because we didn't need them anymore because we had 3 drugs. We didn't know how the TB vaccine worked. You know, we didn't know a whole lot of things fundamental things about the tubercle bacillus. You know, why the drugs worked against it, why it stained acid fast, why any strain was virulent. And the reason we didn't know that, but we had a revolution in biology, was, it's important to know, right? If you haven't seen the movie Invictus, there's a very powerful scene in there where Nelson Mandela said, I had to know my enemy in order to prevail against them. And the reason we didn't know these things about TB is basically Koch's postulate, but talking about DNA and genes. And it's a common theme. You had to have like a phenotype. It's like a disease state. You had to clone the cause, the gene, but then we had to transfer it. And nobody had ever figured out for TB how to transfer the genes. Now, who's got 10? Go ahead.
Why was the first genomic liberty of M. leprae, the leprosy vaccine, not constructed till 1983?
So if we wanted to make a library of the leprosy bacillus, I told you that the leprosy bacillus are related to the tubercle bacillus. We can't grow the leprosy bacillus on artificial media. I don't know if you've ever seen a leper, but here's a leper who came in a leper colony in 1931. Here's the same patient 2 years later. This is why we have leper colonies. I could still take you to some in Brazil and Africa to this day, and India. What revolutionized leprosy research in the 1970s were two groups found out you could grow it in 9-banded armadillos. That's me as a graduate student. I used to take biopsies from lepers, put them into 9-banded armadillos, wait 2 years, and then I got to make the first genomic libraries of leprosy bacillus. It's difficult to work with. Who's got 11? Please.
Why had no one been successful in developing gene transfer genetics for M. tuberculosis till 1987?
I know this is really technical, but I'll tell you, there are two reasons. The tuberculosis, most people didn't want to work with it because it's dangerous. You can just get it by an aerosol infection. But the other aspect of it is we wait for a colony to come up on a plate. A colony, this is a bacterial colony that we plate out from a single cell, but a colony has 1 billion cells. You go from 1 cell to 1 billion. Now they double exponentially. It goes 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. How many generations take you to 1 billion? It's 30. You can plug that into your calculator. We have bacteria like E. coli. They double every 20 minutes. We can get a colony overnight on a plate. Tuberculosis doubles once a day. Leprosy takes 2 weeks to double. The point is it takes you a month, and if you ever try to keep plates around, if you don't have good technique, they're going to be all contaminated. So most people didn't want to do it. Now, 12, last question. Go ahead.
What is a, I'll make everybody else, microbacteriophage?
Do you have any idea? That's okay. So what revolutionized molecular biology, what we discovered viruses, this guy did, Max Delbruck, really pioneered the use of viruses to study molecular biology and gene transfer in E. coli back in the 40s, and he isolated from the East River. I moved to the Bronx, 1985, and I knew I needed to work on these viruses. These are viruses that infect bacteria, and I didn't have any. So I just took dirt from my backyard, and I plated it out, and I got these plaques. You see these holes? The Greek word phagos means to eat. So viruses are called phages because it looks like something's eating the bacteria. But if we look under the microscope, they're these small little particles that go inside and parasites for the bacteria. I got to tell you that this virus I isolated from my backyard, there's now 37 papers in the literature that came from this virus that I use, and it's a very cool virus. These mycobacteria are common soil organisms. So I just took dirt from my backyard. One day I had a lady from Mexico and India I took to lunch at the Bronx Zoo. It's close to Einstein. I love walking around the Bronx Zoo. We saw the sea lions, the tigers, the bears. I got over by the zebra pen. I said, man, I smell a phage. And I reached down and grabbed the dirt and the crap and I put it in my pocket. And I went back to the lab and I isolated BXZ1. I get to name them when you isolate yourself. So this is my first Bronx Zoo one. Now, what's really cool is we can determine the DNA sequence of this. This man, Graham Hatfield, came in the lab in '88, and he said, I want to determine your DNA, the DNA sequences of all your viruses. So he did BXB1, he did BXZ1. He calls me up the day he finishes BXZ1. He says, Bill, do you know anything about lupus? I said, yeah, if you have lupus, you make antibodies against the human protein, Rho. He said, yeah. BXZ1, that thing you found in the zebra shit, excuse me, it has the same homologous gene as the human gene. Why? I don't know. But that day, I used to think that the Bronx Zoo was cool because of all the animals. What's cool are all those microbes. So for the last 25 years, every summer I take high school kids to the Bronx Zoo. You see this woman right here? This is my twin sister, Dept. She had been a medical technologist for 5 years. She got tired of that. She did autopsies for 5 years. Got tired of that. Became a high school biology teacher in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Second day on the job, the superintendent came in and said, Debbie, I expect you to do science projects with your kids. She called me hysterically. She said, what do I do? I said, no problem. Send the kids out phage prospecting. He isolated phage from a barnyard. This one from a rose garden. Corn dog did not come from a corn dog, but you see why we name it. We ended up publishing a paper in this journal called Cell. Where not only did, this is like one of the best journals, not only did we get the cover of Cell, we have the first and only centerfold ever in Cell that exposes the naked genomes of 14 new viruses we isolated from soil. And on the byline, we have 2 high schools, Pelham High School in New York and La Trobe High School in Pennsylvania. My point about these phages, these viruses, they allowed me to go ahead, well, first of all, before Howard Hughes built this wonderful building that opened up 3 years ago, 8 years ago, I'm thinking, how am I going to get kids, how am I going to get young Africans excited about science? So I went to the University of KwaZulu-Natal 8 years ago, and I brought my twin sister with me and my buddy Graham, and we got 11 students from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I took them to a game park, and we took soil samples, and they all isolated new viruses. Here's Lindo. She grew up in the Zulu village. She's the first woman in her village ever get a college degree. She was the first person to isolate a phage. We've carried on this program for the last 9 years. We had 33 students this past year. We isolated 70 new phages. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute has made this sequencing of these viruses that we isolate from soil a national program. And as of last week, there's 700 phage genomes in the database. My twin sister, who's working on her PhD, has probably annotated more than most other people on the planet. The viruses allowed us to go ahead and genetically manipulate mycobacteria. And they allowed us to go ahead and do genetics to move genes around. And let me just tell you that it allowed us then to go back and answer fundamental questions like how the drug isoniazid works. And I think, knowledge is what's going to be the solution to the problem. We need new ways to go ahead and consider how to control TB and how to diagnose it and how to make effective vaccines and drugs. And the reason why I say the problem with TB, we have drugs like isoniazid, but the problem with TB is it's like Harry Houdini. Now, Robert Koch presented that amazing paper on March 24th. We call that World TB Day. Harry Houdini was born on March 24th, World TB Day. Now, he was actually born Eric Weiss in Budapest, Hungary. And his father actually came to the United States to teach at Yeshiva University. I'm not Jewish, but that's our parent institution at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And he brought him over to New York, and when he was there, Harry Houdini fell in love with a magician from France named Hedin, and he took on the name Harry Houdini. And I got to tell you that the big problem with TB is it has the ability to act like Harry Houdini. If we add a drug to TB, and we just count the number of viable bugs on day 1, day 2, day 3, by day 5 we've killed 99.9%. We can't kill any more. Because TB knows how to act like Harry did Houdini and defy death. And that's really why we don't have the eradication of TB, is we don't know how to deal with these persisters, these slow-growing, these Harry Houdinis. And I'm going to stop here. I want to tell you that the solution is going to come from knowledge and imaginative thinking. And the last thing I'll just tell you about for a rapid diagnostic test for TB. If you have TB and you become infected, it takes you a month to grow up a strain and a month to do drug susceptibilities. Because I had these viruses, so this is a tuberculosis, and there's a virus that I first genetically engineered so I could clone any gene into it. For one of the rapid diagnostic tests, what I did was I took the gene from fireflies that make fireflies glow, and I cloned it into this virus, and we added to TB. It makes it glow like a lightning bug. And so now the way that we do drug susceptibilities, we're testing this in Africa, is rather than waiting a month, we take the sample from the patient, we divide it into 5 tubes. We have no drug, first drug, second drug, third drug, and now we add this virus. And if the drug works, the light doesn't come on. If it's drug resistant, the light comes on. Now, you'll hear more. I'm going to stop here. I thank you for participating. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very engaging and exciting talk, Dr. Jacobs. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Elwood up to give a talk, and I believe it's going to be no slides, and it's going to be a discussion with the audience. Thank you very much.
Oh, dear, dear. Armadillos and, oh my God, and animated movies. You know, when I was asked to do this, I said some time ago, who else is speaking? And they said, well, Dr. Bill Jacobs, he's kind of a forceful guy, you know, and we want some a little kind of toned down after that. So I'd never seen what he looked like, and instead of going to PubMed with 278 publications, which means he's got a lot of students, actually. That's what that means. You don't fool us one bit. We know where the 278 comes from. And I've got 7.5, and I know exactly that. So anyway, so I went online, and I had a look at this guy, and they said, oh, my God, he looks like a linebacker. He looks like a college coach for somewhere in Ohio. You know, it's fantastic. I can't compete with that. And then he comes up with that talk, so I'm just going to have a cup of coffee, and I'll see you all around, okay? I can't really do that. I've been described as an emeritus professor here tonight. We were talking about different languages. Emeritus in Latin means past his due date and should get sort of offside a bit. So it's a nice expression they use as they're shoveling you out the door. They haven't managed to do that to me just yet. I still hang around. And I've been around for actually longer than I'd like to admit now, and I first got involved with the care of tuberculosis patients in 1982. So I am probably the senior physician in this province who looks after TB cases. So I've been doing it for quite a long time, and it's quite a fascinating disease to treat. We used to be called TB control. That's too colonial now, because you can't control people now. So we're now TB services, I think is the expression we use. And we go back to 1932 in this province. There's been a place you can go, or a group of people, to treat your tuberculosis in this province since 1932. We did go through all the sanatoria business as well, and it was an interesting experience to be in a sanatorium. It wasn't all bad. I once rented a very large ski cabin up at Whistler from a man, and he said to me, what do you do? And I said, I work in TB. And he says, well, that's interesting, because I had TB, and they stuck me in the sanatorium when I was a young man for about 7 or 8 months. And I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. And he says, well, don't be too sorry. I heard about this thing called a stock market while I was in there. And so I got a book on the stock market, and I went to it, and I said, wait a minute. The people give you their money, and they take the risk, and then I get paid at either end? This is fantastic, and that's exactly what he did. He became a very successful stockbroker and built this rather large mansion at Whistler, which I rented. So it wasn't all bad news. You had lots of time to read, and that's the thing that we don't have anymore. I was really asked to talk about TB in Canada and some of the local things. So we've talked about the global issues, and you've heard that is 8 million new cases, 1.5 million deaths. We should just stop there for a moment. 1.5 million deaths due to a disease that we can treat and prevent. I mean, that's ridiculous. This is a global disgrace, is what we should call it. There's no triumph here at all. This is a total global disgrace, and it's one of my hobby horses, which I won't get into because I'll get too annoyed, so I'll just calm down a bit about it. And anyone who works in TB and has been around the world and seen what it does to people shares the same view. Anyway, let's get back to nice, clean, sanitized Canada. We have about 1,700 cases, new cases of tuberculosis a year in Canada. Now compare that to the Philippines, you would have 93,000 new cases a year. So we're pretty low burden country. And the interesting thing about our rates are that the rates really haven't changed very much in the last 10 or so years. So we can get down to a certain level, and then we cannot get down to what we call elimination of TB. Eliminating a disease is tricky business. We haven't been too successful in that. We've done it with smallpox because we had a vaccine that worked like a hot damn, and you had to have smallpox when I was a kid or you couldn't travel out of the country. You had to have your passport and your little thing saying that you were vaccinated against smallpox, and that's what killed that disease. So you need to have a good vaccine for it, and we might talk about vaccines a little bit later. So the rates, and I'm always told the best way of losing your audience is to throw a bunch of numbers at them. So what I'm going to do is throw a bunch of numbers at you and see whether this is an exceptional audience that doesn't follow the path. Okay, so we have these 1,700 cases. Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia is the bulk of those cases, with the most cases being in Ontario because that's where the most people are. It's also where the most immigrants go to. So, and our TB sort of situation is driven by immigration largely in Canada. So 70% of the cases will be just in those three provinces, and 64% of those people will be foreign-born. 23% of them are Aboriginal, and yet only 3% of the population of Canada is Aboriginal, so they are disproportionately represented. And that's a whole other story, which we don't have time to get into tonight. So we're a low prevalence country. When our TB Institute, we have a thing in our place in the TB Services Division where we keep all the records, actually, and old clippings from newspapers. And I was looking at one day, and my predecessor as a director of that particular program in 1931 was addressing an audience like this. It was like the Rotary Club, as it turns out. And his opening line was, every half hour somebody dies from TB in Vancouver. So that's where we've come from, down to this sanitized little area. In BC, we have 300 new cases a year. So that turns into every single working day we have a new case of TB. Now, if you walk out on the street and stop the first 5 people and say, well, is there any TB in BC? And say, no, that's all gone. There's no reason to worry about that. And there are 300 cases. The trouble with the TB cases that's happening now is they're getting much more complicated. We have problems with interactions with HIV drugs. Multiple drug resistance, which Dr. Jacobs referred to, is used to be a thing we used to read about. We would have 1 case a year, maybe. We have 10 cases on the books now. And I think his prediction that it's beginning to take the airplanes and move around is coming true. And we are in big trouble if that really takes hold. We are back to the sanatorium. And that might happen, who knows, in my lifetime. So we're always keeping an eye on that. So our rates are slightly above the national rates. 72% of our cases are in the foreign-born. We take our immigrants from all over the world, of course, in Canada. We are a big country for immigration. We have 40 to 50,000 immigrants come to BC every single year, and 250,000 immigrants come into Canada every year. And we have a refugee policy as well. So where do those people come from? Well, if you put a list of the highest endemic countries for TB up and then ticked off where our immigration comes from, they're all in that list. So it's almost like we've handpicked the countries with high prevalence. I'm not saying this is a bad thing or anything else about it. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be doing this, because I'd love to take anyone on who wants to say that. That's a whole other discussion. But that is why our TB is driven by the foreign-born, because you bring the rates of TB in your country with you on the aeroplane. The rates are lower in the communities that live in Canada because of the healthy immigrant effect. People that immigrate are healthier than those that don't. So they're lower than the countries, but they do reflect them. We have 11% of our cases are in the Aboriginal population, and 12% of them, that's 1 in 10 of our cases, is Canadian-born. And some of them live not too far from this particular institute, down in the downtown east side. But don't get any idea that you have to be a down and out to have tuberculosis. That is completely. I am currently treating 2 lawyers. We have at least 2 doctors on the books at the moment being treated. And we have a, maybe different from many countries, a middle-class population in British Columbia that gets tuberculosis. They are not down and outs by any means. And I could give you a long list of, well, I can't give you a long list because I'm not supposed to talk about my patients, but I'd love to, of people that get this disease and don't know where they got it largely. Our HIV rates in TB are rather low. HIV is, if you were a company called Tuberculosis and something came along to boost your stock, it would be HIV. It's the best thing that's ever happened to TB Inc. because it attacks the very cells that in our body protects us against tuberculosis. So if you are infected with TB and you happen to be HIV positive and your CD4 counts and your white cells are not working properly, you have 20 to 30 times the risk of getting tuberculosis as opposed to someone who doesn't. So it's part of our problem, and of course very complicated to treat people who are HIV positive. Okay, so what I'd like to do maybe is, instead of just going on with these numbers, I want to talk to you, sort of walk you through what happens if you get TB, okay, in this province. What happens if you get it in this town? What's your path? What are you going to have to face? Well, the first problem is you're going to be looking at 6 months minimum of treatment. We have not been able to bring TB down lower than 6 months. And we're going to give you a whole bunch of drugs. Actually, it's more likely we'll treat you for 9 months for various reasons, not 6, but we'll tell you that at the beginning, sort of. We'll throw 9 at you, then if we get away with 6, that's a bonus. If you've got multiple drug-resistant disease, and I just saw a lady the other day, she's on her 19th month of treatment. She will require 20 months of treatment. And so we're going to get to know you very, very well. You're going to come into our clinic and we're going to start a relationship with you. with the doctors there, and more importantly with the nursing staff, who are actually the ones that treat tuberculosis, not doctors. We just sit around in our offices looking at x-rays, but they actually do the treating. And, you know, the questions then start, well, can I go to work? Well, you can't go to work because you're infectious. You mean I have to stay off? Yeah, you have to stay off work. And well, my exams are next week. I need to go to school. I have a flight booked next week where it's our honeymoon. We're going off on no, no, no. So all we do for the first little while is tell people no, no, no. So we're not really that popular when we start out. So we give them advice in that. What about, do I have to go into hospital? Why don't we put everybody in hospital with TB? We do have a TB ward. It's the last sort of vestige of the sanatorium in Vancouver, which lives in the Vancouver General Hospital, and we have about 12 beds there, and they're always full for various reasons. But most cases with tuberculosis, in fact, you don't need to go to hospital. We treat them as outpatients. And that was a big advance, actually, as you go through the history of TB, was getting people out of sanatorium, telling them they didn't have to stay in bed for months on end, that they could actually be treated at home among their families with appropriate precautions. We're going to put you on a whole bunch of drugs. We're going to put you on 4 different antibiotics, each of which has a list of side effects this long. Some of them overlap, and some of them are unique side effects. Some of them can affect your eyes. Some of them can affect your liver. Some of them rarely can affect your kidneys, your blood cells. It goes on and on. So this is a real bad news moment for people to realize they're going to have to not take one antibiotic for a couple of weeks, but multiple antibiotics, with all kinds of problems attached to them. Now, some people tolerate them very, very well. Other people, as soon as they take them, it's a mess. We have to start around with the drugs, we have to play around with it and go into second-line drugs and all the rest of it. So it's quite an art, actually, handling the side effects of drugs. It's interesting. We had a conference recently in town, and one speaker got up and said, you know, we don't need sort of better drugs for TB. We don't need more efficacious drugs. We need safer drugs for TB. If we had the same drugs that would cure the disease in the same time but were less toxic, we'd be way ahead of the game. And we can talk about drug development in question time maybe, but that is a far in the future where we get safer drugs. So, well, what happens if I've got these side effects? And what, do I have to come into the clinic or what? No, you can phone up the clinic. You can speak to a nurse in our clinic any time, at least during the working days. You can speak to a doctor if you want to. You can walk in off the street and we will see you. We have a clinic in Vancouver. We have one in New West. We have one in Victoria. And we have an area in the downtown east side which is really a TB clinic, basically. So we'll see you in any one of these clinics. You can just walk in off the street if you like. I should go back just one little step, and that's before we can treat you, you need to get diagnosed with TB. And I would advise you, if you're thinking of getting TB, get it in your lungs, for heaven's sake. Don't get it anywhere else. Because if you get it anywhere else, it won't be thought of as the first reason for that. And some time ago, we looked at the delay in diagnosis. For instance, if you have TB in a joint, it will take you about 12 months to get a diagnosis. People will tell you it's arthritis, it's this, it's that, and the other thing. And remember, and maybe you don't know this, but TB can affect any part of your body, not just the lungs, and I mean any part. The only place I have never seen TB is in the teeth. So we've seen it in thymus gland, you see it in the skin, you see it in the lymph glands very commonly. We have seen it everywhere, and it's tricky to diagnose because people don't think of it, and it's a great mimicker of other diseases. So so get it in your lungs, for heaven's sake, because you'll be in big trouble otherwise, because you won't get a diagnosis, and that's always bad news. Well, I don't live in Vancouver. You've got all these fancy clinics there, and that's not where I live. So what's that good to me? I live up in Fort Nelson. Well, we can treat you in Fort Nelson as well. You don't have to come down here to get your pills. We'll treat you up there, and we do that through the local health unit. So your liaison with us down here will be through your own physician and the public health nurses in the health units anywhere in the province. Well, I don't have any money, so can I still be treated for this disease? This is a public health issue, and any public health issue, because the public is at risk, there's no cost to anybody to be treated for tuberculosis in this country. Well, I'm a visitor. I've just arrived. I don't have insurance. You can come into our clinic and we will start you on medication, and it won't cost you a cent, even though you are a visitor, because we want to cure you. We're not interested in whether you have money or not. And the way it works is that we supply all your medication for the entire length of time that you happen to be. If you want to stay in Canada, if you're a visitor, for instance, we will give you all the meds you need. Don't get into hospital, though, because if you're a visitor and you don't have insurance and you end up in hospital, now you're in big trouble, because the man in a suit will come round after you've been there for 3 days and hand you a bill for $6,000. And say, well, I've only been here for 3 days. That's right, 6,000. So you don't want to do that. So it's best to travel with... and that applies to anybody. You know, there's a business here where you have to be 3 months in the province before you get medical coverage. We don't care about that. All right? So you will always be treated, and you will not be charged for seeing the physician or seeing the nurses or anything else. This is a public health issue, and therefore that is taken care of in our wisdom, I might add. We have what's called a centralized TB program in this province. We control all the data related to TB. We control all the drugs. And those two feed off each other. You can't be treated in this province for tuberculosis without us knowing about it, because we supply the drugs through our pharmacy. And these drugs are peculiar to TB. For instance, isoniazid, that my colleague mentioned, is not used for anything else. If you're on isoniazid, then it's related to TB. It might be prevention, but it also could be active disease. And it goes for the other drugs too. They are, most of them are absolutely specific for tuberculosis, rifampin being the exception to that. So this allows us to have a rock-solid handle on all the cases we have, and that rock-solid handle dates back to 1932. We have continuous data going back to 1932, which is one of the longest and best sort of databases, I would suggest, in the planet. Not to boast too much, but okay. So I want to just mention immigration, because there's always this kind of thing, well, why don't you stop them coming here then? I mean, I'm an immigrant myself, I might add. And I grew up in a place with quite a high prevalence of tuberculosis in Ireland. And my uncle died of tuberculosis in a little cottage prior to there being any treatment, and all the family brought him to the cottage and waited for him to die. That's what you did. So I'm an immigrant myself. You cannot come to Canada if you have active disease. So as part of the medical examination that you require before you come to Canada, if they find that you have active disease, you have to be treated before you come here. Then you can come to Canada. It doesn't exclude you from coming to Canada. Now, the immigration process is only designed to pick up people with active tuberculosis. It is not designed to examine you to see whether you've got TB that's sleeping inside you, that's inactive or latent. Okay, there's lots of terms for that. TB is a smart bug. You get infected and it hides. It hides. And then it'll wake up later. It might wake up in 2 years, might wake up in 6 months. It might wake up in 30 years, 40 years, or 50 years. It can hide for that long. And indeed, if our basic science researchers, I would suggest that if we learn how the organism does that and its dormancy, we could do big things here. So immigration is not designed to stop people coming to Canada who are infected, if I can use that term, that have TB that's sleeping inside them. It's not designed for that. And how would we do it even? We have 250,000 people. And if we screen them with the imperfect tools that we have to see who's infected, nobody would be allowed to come to Canada, for heaven's sake. Yeah, well, we don't have the resources to even attempt to do that. So you have your medical, and you come to Canada. If there's anything on your X-ray that suggests TB, or you have inactive disease, as it's called, or you have a history of being treated, or anything to do with TB, you are referred to a public health facility, and that is a condition of your landing. All right? You have to fulfill that condition of your landing, or you'll never become a citizen. Do you have a question?
Do students have that?
Do students have?
I think not. Students come from all over the world to UBC.
Yeah.
They're not required to
Yes.
show that.
Oh, yeah. Well, the magic, I think the magic number, that is true. The magic time to is 6 months. If you come to Canada for 6 months from several countries, you do not need a medical examination before you come.
But they come with TB and then TB shows up.
Yes, we do see TB in lots of students from all kinds of places, and I don't
understand why we don't require that.
Yes, at the very basics. The trouble is that most people who come to Canada develop their TB. Everything was normal before they came. So you still have to pick out the needles in the haystack of the people that's going to develop it. Because your X-ray could be totally normal. That X-ray is valid for nearly 12 months. So you could have had the X-ray 12 months ago. And then you come, and then it's another 6 months, and then you break down with your TB. So yes, if the system was perfect, everyone would have an X-ray the day they leave their country of origin. But that's not the way the system works. So it is a bit of a problem, and we see lots of students. You're absolutely right. You want to?
I was thinking that maybe some of the questions were. There's some more questions from the audience. How much time do you have, or do you need?
No, I'm happy. Well, maybe I'll just finish off, and then we'll. Okay. Yeah, we talked. That thing is called post-landing surveillance, and you have to come. As I said, there's no real stick to this. In other words, you're handed a piece of paper at the airport. You're told you must report to a public health facility, which happens to be us. And if you don't, nobody comes around and sends you back or anything like that. If you go for citizenship, though, it will say you have not fulfilled this. And you then have, so we see people that have been in the country for 5 years saying, oh, I'm just coming for my landing surveillance issue. So it's not a big deal. Anyway, I'd just like to say that TB in Canada is basically good news. You have a very, very low chance of getting tuberculosis in Vancouver even. However, 300 people a year in our province do, but you have a very, very low chance. And even if you do, you will be well treated, you will be cured, which is not what we can say for the 4,500 people that have died today from TB. Thank you very much. Wants to sit down?
So at this point, if we could ask both of the speakers to come to the front here. And if you've written down any burning questions, I'm going to come around and pick them up, and then I'm going to try to field the questions to the speakers. Okay, we'll get on with some questions. We've got about half an hour for some questions. First, actually, there were a couple of individuals in the audience that kind of had stories, and they didn't really want to write them down, and there were some comments. So first, let's go to a story or a question with a story behind it.
Okay, so my question is, if you are exposed to TB, what should you do about it? And the reason, I'm asking that question is about a year ago, I actually went to VGH, to the emergency, because I thought I was having a heart attack. I had pain to my chest and my arm was going numb, so I went to the emergency. It very soon appeared that wasn't the case, but they were very thorough, and they insisted on keeping me in the hospital all day. So they put me in a separate room, and they came and tested me all day. And I was sharing the room with another woman, and there was a curtain between us. And she was also being tested for heart problems. Anyway, I was there with her all day. At the end of the day, the nurse suddenly came in and she was wearing a mask. So I was like, this isn't a good sign. Anyway, she goes to my neighbor first, and she goes, well, the good news, Mrs. X, is that you don't have any heart problems. The bad news is you've got TB. So I was like, oh my God, well, I've been with her all day, and she's been coughing. And then she comes to me, and my doctor comes to me, and they say, we can absolutely guarantee you we're not having a heart attack. You have nothing wrong with your heart. I said, but I'm going to be one of those cases where I go into hospital perfectly healthy, and then I come out with TB. So, what about that? And the doctor just sort of brushed it off, and he said, oh, you've got no chance of that. You've got more chance of being hit by a bus in Vancouver. I said, in Vancouver, that's probably a high probability. But anyway, they didn't really follow up. They just kind of, laughed it off, and that was a year ago. But I do know, I also come from KwaZulu-Natal, so I'm very aware of TB and the fact that it can be dormant for a long time. So should I go and be tested? What are the chances of me being infected?
We all do, yes. Well, I'm sorry about that. Glad you didn't have a heart attack. I think your chances of getting infected in your homeland are multiple times what they are here. I don't know if you've ever been tested for tuberculosis. The standard protocol for that would be that we would do a skin test on you and various things at a point 8 weeks since you were last in contact with the case. And we could, now with some newer tools that we have a pretty good shot at whether you were infected or not. If we found out that you were infected, however, we could not tell you that you were infected from that exposure. And in fact, you're multiples more, I don't know when you left South Africa, but you're much more likely to be infected there than this brief exposure in hospitals. And it's a very, very cursory exposure, and I agree with the description of unlikelihood that you're going to be infected. But come on down, we can test you.
I did mention that I'd grown up in South Africa, and that when we were at school, we were always tested with like a skin test, and they said because of that, they could not do that with me, and that I'd have to have another kind of a test.
Yeah, but we can do a skin test on you. If the skin test is negative, that's helpful information. If it's positive, we're no further ahead because you'll tell me that you had a BCG, and we could have another discussion about how long that lasts and affects the skin test, which we won't get into now. We now have another test, though, that comes from our basic scientists that will enable us to distinguish between positivity due to a BCG vaccination and in true infection.
And if I could just kind of, from some of the questions that are in front of me and stemming from this discussion, could you briefly describe what tests are available, and maybe from the clinical side, but also the basic science side on how the basic science is developing newer and more rapid tests to detect a TB, and kind of as a segue with that as well is how many different types of TB strains are out there, and do these TB tests detect all the different strains? And some of those questions were asked.
Okay, well, I'll take the tests we have. The tuberculin skin test is a very bad test. It's been around for 100 years. We've all had it. Probably everyone in this room has had a tuberculin skin test at one time or another. Go to any kind of school, healthcare facility, anything, you need a skin test done. So it's a very bad test. It does not distinguish between confounders, one being the vaccination and the other cross-reactivity with these things that are the first cousins of TB, not leprosy necessarily, but atypical mycobacteria, which are organisms that grow in the soil. And I'd love my colleague to get interested in those organisms because we don't know what to do with the patients that get infected with them. That's a whole other discussion. So, and now we have, we're slowly replacing the skin test with a thing called an interferon gamma release assay. So what we will do is we will take out your blood cells, your white cells, we will expose them to specific antigens that are specific for M. tuberculosis and not found in the BCG strain of the TB. And we will ask the white cells, have you ever met this before? The white cells will think for a while, and then they will squirt you with interferon gamma, which can be detected, and that means the answer is yes. So we have nice tools now to be able to really tell us quite confidently whether you're infected or not. They're not perfect, though, and we're learning more and more about their imperfections as time goes on.
This interferon gamma squirt test, what's the turnover time for it in the clinic currently?
Yeah, well, it takes us 2 weeks because they batch them, so it'll take you 2 weeks to get your result, as opposed to the skin test, which we'll read in 48 hours.
Okay. And Bill, with respect to the up-and-coming and basic science diagnostic tests, maybe specifically talking about the different strains of TB that are out there, and if you can distinguish the different strains if you're infected.
The biggest concern for somebody coming from Africa is, do you have a strain that's drug resistant? So there is a test if you have active TB, a new test called the Expert, that basically uses a PCR test as a polymerase chain reaction. It amplifies DNA, nucleic acids, and it has different colored dyes. And it can pretty much ascertain, one, if you have TB, and if you have rifampicin resistance. But the other drug resistance is, well, number one, you'd have to have basically an active infection for a test like that. But even then, if you have the second, third, fourth drug resistances, we don't have better tests. The virus phage test I told you we're still developing. There's a lot of other things underway in the basic scientists But tuberculosis is a hard problem to work on because it works, grows so slowly, and it's there's not as much money as we should have into basic research on it. So there's challenges before us on this.
And maybe I'll move on from the challenges being faced, and I think one of those challenges is the money going into the industry. And is this one of the reasons why there's not a good vaccine? And I was wondering if, from the clinical perspective, you can describe why the vaccine is not good enough, and then from the basic science perspective, maybe what are some of the problems facing making a new vaccine that could counter some of these different strains that are out there?
Well, the BCG vaccination has been around a long time as well. People say to me, well, does it work? Does it work? And I say, well, it's given in 172 countries around the world, BCG vaccination. Not generally in Canada, there's a few places it's being used. And those countries have the highest prevalence of tuberculosis of anywhere in the world. So if you're giving a vaccine in a place that has high prevalence, quod est demonstrando, it doesn't work. It does not work, Your Honor. And that's the case for the prosecution. So now it does have, the efficacy has been argued, but the pat answer is probably have an efficacy of about 50%. It is very good, however, at preventing serious forms of tuberculosis in children, particularly miliary tuberculosis, where the bug runs around your whole body, and also TB meningitis, which is a very, very devastating and bad disease to get. So there we are. It's not. The problem is it's just not good enough as a vaccine. It would hardly get on the market now. Although I noticed the zoster vaccine for shingles has an efficacy of 50%. So there we are. Build us a new vaccine.
That's a major effort by many scientific TB researchers around the world. One of the problems, though, is that it's very difficult. It's a long-term experiment. For me to do a typical vaccine experiment in a mouse, that's going to be a year-long experiment with a lot of mice. It cost me, like $5 a day to keep, mouse cage and whatever. It's an expensive experiment to keep them around. And I have to tell you that, we've seen some vaccines that have efficacy in mice, but then when we move to other animal models like non-human primates, which would be a better assay, probably closer to humans, we find that they don't work. And when you start talking about keeping monkeys around for, a year, the costs are very expensive. So it's a lot of effort and a lot of basic science being done, but it's a very difficult problem.
1.3 million people are dying every year. HIV is a chronically manageable disease in my lifetime. Sorry, I'm a TB nurse and I get a bit frustrated. And so I think you're right, it's very expensive, but I think when are we going to actually do that?
So, and maybe from that, there are some discussion on how can we campaign and increase awareness, and who are the contact points or the non-government organizations or the drug companies that are actually pushing forward active programs in TB, either drug research or vaccine development. Are there contact points and are there specific champions for this internationally? I guess on the basic research as well as the public health concerns.
Clearly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has played a significant role in putting funds into that, but it's not enough. and there's not enough, the drug companies, let's face it, okay, if we did have an efficacious vaccine, it probably could turn a profit. But for the most part, tuberculosis is a disease primarily of poor people. And there's not a motivation like that for HIV or hepatitis C that you would have with tuberculosis.
Yeah, and that is reflected, of course, in the funding. The national NIH throws $2.8 billion a year at HIV research, and I think our equivalent is $400 million. So yes, and HIV is a great story of, how to do things differently. We could have another forum on that here some evening, how HIV evolved and how the research was accelerated and how drugs were short-channeled and all kinds of things. Since 1960, we've had 2 new drugs that have come on the market for tuberculosis, and the HIV community has at least 30, and they're getting better and better at it all the time and combining drugs and all the rest of it.
And like you said, they're good drugs. They don't have these horrible, horrible side effects. Now you can take one drug for HIV
they're
every day.
getting safer. So, and the problem is, again, with the other drugs that we've had for tuberculosis, we've just come on the coattails of Big Pharma because we found that, some of the drugs that were designed to treat respiratory infections, not tuberculosis, have efficacy with TB. We just got in on the coattails of those. They weren't specifically designed for that purpose.
And if I just want to make the point that, when you think about it, what Kevin was saying about if you have TB, you have to basically go on 4 drugs for 6 months. I mean, over that time, and that's like horrendous when you think about it. When you think of a typical staph or strep infection, you're on a drug for 2 weeks. And the problem is there are these latent, dormant, Harry Houdini-like TB, and we don't know how to kill them. And that too is a major effort on a lot of people's parts, focusing on killing these Harry Houdinis of TB, and it's a hard problem.
Well, that actually kind of leads into another question that's here is why is some TB latent? And why does it hide? And why does it hide for 10, 20, 30, 40 years? And what is it? What are the triggers that lead to it coming out from it being Harry Houdini and being a persister? Maybe both, again, clinically, if there's some observations, but also from the basic science perspective.
Yeah, this gets out of my comfort zone.
Perfect.
Dormancy. Yeah, it's very, very clever. I mean, this is fantastic stuff. Now, before we get too concerned about TB in one sense, we have to realize that the body has a natural defense against it, our so-called innate immune system. Otherwise, the world would have been wiped out from tuberculosis before there was any treatment. And like every epidemic, it tends to do this and then comes down. And indeed, the epidemic of tuberculosis globally was coming down even before we had treatment for it. So things were changing other than throwing drugs at it. I don't know how it hides. I know things that the body will give up trying to police it. And there's many diseases that will do that. The list is quite long. What's concerning to us now is that diabetes is becoming like the common cold. Everybody is now getting diabetes, and diabetes is a good trigger factor for the reactivation of tuberculosis, particularly if it's badly controlled, if your diabetes is out of control. HIV, we've already mentioned, is number 1. Inc. Best thing can happen to TB Inc. is HIV. Then you've got drugs that are used to intentionally suppress your immune system because that's how you treat them, like rheumatoid arthritis now. We have new kids on the block. That is an industry for us. We get so many patients being referred to us now to see whether they can go on these new drugs. And that's an interesting story. I'll just a little sideline there. These things called TNF inhibitors were brought out and brought to the market, and it was only in the post-marketing surveillance that they found out that, wait a minute, people were getting tuberculosis who had rheumatoid arthritis on these drugs. And even though the basic physiology would have told you that blocking this particular component of the immune system will almost certainly allow TB to reactivate, it wasn't really talked about until after the marketing. And these drugs are now being used all over the place. Other things that can reactivate, chronic renal failure is another one that we deal with. And then there's people that for absolutely no reason will just decide that their TB will reactivate, and we have no idea why.
Thank you.
I think, one of the things I've come to see in bacteria, it's in a lot of ways almost like treating cancer in a sense. There's a lot of cancers that we can treat now, but there's a lot of cancers that we cannot. Now, I'll tell you what's common between the cancers that we cannot treat that's similar to tuberculosis is your death rate of any killing agent is directly proportional to your growth rate. So if you have a fast-growing bacteria, you can kill it very quickly. If you have a slow-growing bacteria, like tuberculosis, it takes longer to kill. So it's almost that it's evolved this amazing strategy to grow slowly. And we don't understand yet why tuberculosis grows so slowly compared to other bacteria, or why the leprosy bacillus grows so slowly. It has a lot of tricks to hide itself from the immune system, and it's almost, I'm convinced when we think about the BCG vaccination, Kevin pointed out it's been given since 1921 when the first child was given. But the TB bacillus is evolving, just as we're seeing the evolution of drug resistance. It probably has, we know it has evolved mechanisms to hide itself from the immune system. And that's part of the reason, too, that the BCG vaccine probably doesn't work as well, because it's evolved, because it's been given to so many people. So there's challenges.
On the evolution of TB, there was a question that was asking about the active pattern and I guess the pathology, what's observed in the clinic. Over time, has the pathology changed with the different strains, or do the strains still end up doing the same thing to the lungs and lead to pathology?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. You look down the microscope, you take a biopsy from someone with TB, it'll look exactly the same as the pictures we saw from 100 years ago. The body. The interesting thing about TB is that it's not the bug that's chewing away at the lung. It's not Pac-Man, which people think of Pac-Man eating away at you. It's actually the immune response that causes the problem. It's the body trying to defend against this and forming these granulomas that we talked about. And then those granulomas breaking down that actually does a disservice. It's a peculiar way of looking at a disease, but it's actually the body's attempt to defend itself that gets it into trouble.
And Bill, I guess the same question. In your lab, in the lab setting, looking at these different strains, is the pathology different, or has it always been the same? It's just they become resistant to the new drugs.
Yeah, no, it's pretty much the same. But the part about it that you have to keep in mind that tuberculosis is just not a homogeneous organism. You have the fast growing for TB that do get killed by the drugs in the immune system, but then it has the ability to go in a slowly replicating state. And those are the things that we don't know how to kill, and they're just going to outlast, the immune response or the drugs. And that's what we have to do, is figure out how to kill those hairy Houdinis.
And there was a comment here that, please feel free to comment.
I am engineering and also a reflexologist. I have clients who have cancer from the stomach and also diabetes. There is all general all kinds of illnesses. So we are not only physical illnesses, we have also spiritual illnesses. So like I'm always explain, like for example, smoking. That is one of the causes when we have tuberculosis. So because they have some difficulties, we need only to love and forgive each other, that they turn alive so that the difficulties can. So when we have illnesses, so the Lord's family, we need only to confess our sins, so the Holy Spirit will possess our soul and heal us by the rosary and in the Bible. And for the dying, we need also to consider to pass so that those who are going to remove this world, just don't leave this not the time. And it's funny when we train Alpha to pass Wednesday and Friday, we have also power to overcome all kinds of lifestyle for 40 days and the ascent of the feast on the last week. You have this presentation that there's a lot of died from the previous because they don't naturally apply what I'm sharing today. Because the Lord's family, after September 11, 20% only responded. Because they believe what I'm sharing. Now 3/4 of the group are practicing 1/4, but we need to continue to practice so that we will have peace next year, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just take a comment on the spirituality of TB. It was thought at one time that the creative genius actually came from the tuberculosis, because as Bill was showing there were so many people that were productive, creative, spiritual, artistic, and the list is endless. Robert Louis Stevenson, Paganini. Paganini's landlady threw him out because she thought she had some idea that it was infectious, this thing that he had, this coughing up blood. She threw him out. George Orwell, Nelson Mandela, you name it, D.H. Lawrence, it goes on and on. Who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde?
Who wrote it? I don't know.
Yeah, who wrote it?
Who?
The dude.
Anyway,
Louis Stevenson?
it was Robert. Yeah, it was Robert Louis Stevenson. You're absolutely right. He wrote that book in 3 days because he found out that he had TB and decided to get the hell on with it. And he wrote it in 3 days. And if you read Keats's poem, Keats died of tuberculosis too, a very young man. He woke up one day with blood on the pillow, and he knew exactly what that meant. And he wrote a fantastic poem that starts off, I can't remember all of it, but it starts off, when I think that I may cease to be, because he realized that this was it. Beautiful poem, look it up. So there's lots of spirituality around at least the older beliefs about tuberculosis. I guess it's part of the human dilemma. When you know that the end, you can see the end, things tend to accelerate.
There was a question, and I think it's kind of relevant being in Vancouver and recently with all the rain and the gray clouds, is where does vitamin D play into this, and how is the vitamin D actually sort of preventing the tuberculosis spread? And has there been any clinical trials where vitamin D has been used as a supplement? And I guess I could add, is there any sort of epidemiology or associations in the population in areas where there's less sunlight, there's more TB?
There definitely are, like Barry Bloom, Robert Mondlin had demonstrated that for people of color, they have less ability to make vitamin D, and so you correlate less control. And that's been something that's been seen. I have to tell you, though, it would make sense. It's relevant to go ahead and consider trying vitamin D in a clinical trial. I don't think it's crazy, but no drug company's going to pay for that. We had a paper last year where we actually discovered, serendipitously, that vitamin C will sterilize tuberculosis in culture. And it's high dose. It's Linus Pauling-like doses. But that's not crazy. Vitamin C is non-toxic, etc. But nobody's going to pay for that clinical trial of vitamin C and vitamin D because it's not it's a hard trial to do. It would be very costly. No drug company's going to make any money out of it. So it's a big problem, and I don't really know how we could ever get those done right now.
And the nice thing is we can cure the disease without it. And even if you are vitamin D deficient, we will still cure you. And lots of people, if you do their vitamin D levels, they're low, and it varies too, and it's a tricky thing to even to say someone's vitamin D deficient, but it's been around a long time, the supposition that vitamin D deficiency, will help your TB reactivate, and that treatment with it will also help you at the other end.
I've got one more question here, and in the interest of time too. At which stage during the standard antibiotic treatment of TB does the risk of transmitting TB drop to realistically 0?
Oh, that's my favorite question.
A planted question.
Shut the door, nobody leaves. We can throw this one around. There's two schools of thought. There's a very prominent TB physician who preaches that as soon as they're on the drugs, that's it. They're not infectious anymore. And then he says, well, can they work in a children's nursery then on day 2? Well, no, not on day 2. And so he preaches it, but he actually doesn't put his money where his mouth is. So I just read an interesting article recently because one of my pet asks to the scientific world was to have a test for viability of the organisms, okay? We can look at an organism down a microscope, we can see the thing, we don't know whether it's alive or not. And even if we use PCR technique, we don't know whether this thing is alive or dead. Now, there was an article recently that showed that, maybe they're finally coming up with something like that. And then we would have this wonderful technique. We could take your sputum, and then we could do it on a daily basis or a weekly basis, and then we can tell you the moment that these bugs are now dead or dying, and you're no longer infectious. The textbook answer to that question is 2 weeks. The trouble with that game is we don't know whether you have a sensitive or a resistant organism at 2 weeks because we haven't done all the stuff that we need to do because the organism has to grow, first of all, before we can test it against our antibiotics. So if it's sensitive, but you don't know that at the time, then 2 weeks is pretty good. We have grown tuberculosis months into treatment, despite the fact that they've had sensitive organisms, so it's a very exact science as it goes. But I'd be interested in my colleagues' comments on it.
I have to leave here with a great sense, and I remain very optimistic because we have unprecedented opportunities right now for research on TB that we've never had before. When I tell you that we have moved the genes around, but this stuff, we did know a lot of this fundamental stuff back in 1985, but we do now. Still, we have a long way to go. But I think that the possibility, and I'm going to remain optimistic, that it's unprecedented with what we could do on the genetics on tuberculosis now and understanding the organism, understanding the problem of persistence, as well as the animal models that we have, with mice, etc. I think it's, in my mind, one of the most exciting times in my life on tuberculosis research. And I hope that the public doesn't get complacent. There's a real need that, we can do it, and we need the support of, you people and people in America. other people around the world to go ahead and get it done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to say we're going to wrap up the evening, but I'd first like to say the thanks to the Vancouver Public Library for supporting this event, and the Life Science Institute as well supporting the event, and a sponsor, the TBVets. But most importantly, I'd like to thank the audience for coming out, because it's showing your interest in learning a little bit more about the disease and engaging with the scientists here, and as well, really these two prominent researchers in TB have taken time out of their schedules and have done an excellent job at communicating the science in a digestible format to the public. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming this evening.